The mess hall was packed with 300 hardened Marines, but you could hear a pin drop when the crack of bone hitting bone echoed across the room. "Die, bitch," he spat. He thought he was putting a low-ranking nobody in her place. He had no idea he'd just assaulted a Tier 1 Navy SEAL. Camp Lemonnier, Djibouti, was less a military base and more an oven built on a dust bowl. The midday sun baked the corrugated metal roofs, and the air conditioning in the main mess hall was fighting a losing battle against the collective body heat of hundreds of service members. It smelled of industrial-grade bleach, overcooked pasta, and stale sweat. In the far corner of the room, sitting alone at a metal table, was a woman who practically blended into the beige walls. Her name was Sarah Jenkins, though her personnel file, if you possessed the extremely rare top-secret SCI clearance required to even acknowledge its existence, simply referred to her by her call sign, Whisper. To the untrained eye, Sarah looked entirely unremarkable. She was 5'9", lean, and wore sterile desert combat utilities. Her uniform lacked any identifying markers, no name tape, no rank insignia, no unit patch. Even the American flag was stripped from her shoulder, leaving only the fuzzy rectangles of empty Velcro. Her dirty blonde hair was pulled back into a messy utilitarian bun, and her face was smeared with a thin film of pale dust and engine grease. She looked like a low-level civilian contractor, or perhaps an exhausted logistics clerk who had been pulling double shifts in the motor pool. The reality was entirely different. Sarah was running on exactly 42 minutes of sleep over the past 3 days. She had just returned from a highly classified, off-the-books kinetic strike in the Horn of Africa. She was part of a shadow initiative within the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, commonly known as SEAL Team 6. While the Pentagon publicly debated the logistics of fully integrating women into special operations, the reality was that female operators had been quietly doing the darkest, dirtiest work for years under deep cover. Sarah was an apex predator, a master of close-quarters combat, advanced reconnaissance, and high-value target extraction. But right now, all the deadliest woman in Africa wanted was a lukewarm cup of black coffee and a plate of dry chicken. The low hum of the mess hall was suddenly shattered by the booming, abrasive laughter of Corporal Derek Tanner. Tanner was a wall of muscle and misplaced aggression. Standing 6'3" and tipping the scales at 220 pounds, the Marine was fresh off a combat deployment where he had seen just enough action to think he was invincible, but not enough to learn humility. He strutted into the chow hall, flanked by his usual entourage, a nervous private first class named Jimmy Dawson, and a sycophantic lance corporal named Ryan Matthews. Tanner had a notorious reputation on base. He was a bully who hid behind his rank and physical size, particularly notorious for his vocal, archaic opinions about female personnel serving in combat zones. To him, the base was a boys' club, and anyone who didn't fit his definition of a warrior was simply in his way. Tanner scanned the crowded room, a tray of food balanced on one massive hand. "Place is packed," he grumbled, his voice carrying over the din of clattering silverware. "I'm not sitting next to the latrines again. Where's a clear table?" Matthews pointed toward the back corner. "Over there, Corporal." Just one contractor sitting at a 6-seater. Tanner's eyes locked onto Sarah. He took in her slumped posture, the lack of rank on her chest, and the exhausted way she was staring into her coffee cup. To his predatory mindset, she was the perfect target, weak, isolated, and insignificant. "Perfect," Tanner sneered, adjusting his posture to look as wide and intimidating as possible. "Let's go relieve the supply clerk of her prime real estate." Dawson hesitated, his youthful face pale. "Corporal, there are empty seats a few tables down." "We don't have to—" "Shut up, Dawson," Tanner snapped, already marching across the linoleum floor. "Marines eat where they want. Contractors eat where we let them." Sarah heard them coming before she saw them. Years of hypervigilance training made her acutely aware of the heavy, aggressive cadence of Tanner's boots. She didn't look up, instead taking a slow, measured sip of her coffee. The caffeine tasted like battery acid, but she welcomed the burn. She just wanted peace. She mentally willed the approaching men to walk past her. Tanner stopped dead in front of her table, his shadow falling over her tray. He slammed his heavy plastic tray onto the metal table, the sound echoing like a gunshot. A few heads turned from neighboring tables but quickly looked away. No one wanted to get involved with Tanner's temper. "You're in my seat, sweetheart," Tanner said, his voice dripping with condescension. Sarah didn't flinch. She slowly set her coffee mug down, her eyes still fixed on her plate. "There are 5 other seats here," she said, her voice completely flat, devoid of any emotion or fear. "Take your pick." Tanner's jaw clenched. He was used to civilians and lower enlisted personnel, scattering like roaches when he barked. Her calm indifference felt like a direct challenge to his authority. "I don't like sharing," Tanner growled, leaning heavily on the table to crowd her space. "And I definitely don't like sharing with unmarked nobodies who haven't earned the right to sit in the big boy room. So pack up your little tray and find a corner to cry in." Now, Private Dawson swallowed hard, shifting uncomfortably from foot to foot. "Corporal, maybe we should just—" I said, "Shut up, Dawson." Tanner barked, never taking his eyes off Sarah. He reached out and aggressively shoved her tray. The plastic skidded across the metal table, knocking over her coffee. The dark liquid spilled across the surface, dripping down onto her sterile desert boots. For a terrifying, stretched-out second, the world seemed to stop spinning. Sarah finally looked up. She didn't look angry. She didn't look scared. She looked through him. It was the notorious 1,000-yard stare, the cold, dead-eyed calculation of a warrior who has seen the absolute worst of humanity and survived it by becoming worse. "You spilled my coffee," Sarah said softly. "I'll spill your teeth next if you don't get the hell out of my chair." Tanner spat back, his face flushing red with rage. He had committed to the confrontation in front of his men, and his massive ego refused to let him back down from a woman. "Walk away, Corporal," Sarah advised. It wasn't a threat, it was a genuine, clinical warning. She knew what her hands were capable of. She knew the sheer amount of kinetic violence coiled in her muscles, waiting for the trigger. She was trying to save his life, but Tanner only heard defiance. Tanner snapped. The disrespect, the sheer audacity of this unmarked, exhausted woman refusing to cower before him was too much for his fragile, inflated ego. "Die, bitch!" Tanner roared, his voice tearing through the ambient noise of the mess hall. He planted his left foot, utilizing all 220 pounds of his bulk, and threw a massive, looping right hook aimed directly at her jaw. It was a haymaker meant to end fights instantly, a brutal, unforgiving strike that would have shattered the skull of an average person. But Sarah Jenkins was not an average person. Time dilated for Sarah. As Tanner's shoulder telegraphed the punch, her autonomous nervous system took over. Before the fist was even halfway to her face, her body reacted with the terrifying, deeply ingrained muscle memory of thousands of hours of close-quarters combat training. She didn't block it. Blocking absorbs force. She deflected it, with a movement so fast it was a blur to the onlookers. Sarah slipped her head a fraction of an inch to the left. Tanner's massive fist sailed past her ear, finding nothing but empty air. The sheer momentum of his missed punch pulled him forward, throwing him completely off balance. In a fraction of a second, Sarah's right hand shot up like a striking viper. A palm crashed violently into the side of Tanner's elbow joint. The single Faber name, permanently etched in cartilage, cracked through the air. Tanner screamed, a high-pitched sound of sudden, blinding agony. But Sarah wasn't finished. Devastating violence of action was the cornerstone of SEAL CQB doctrine. You don't just stop a threat, you dismantle it entirely. Using his forward momentum against him, Sarah pivoted on her heel, grabbed Tanner by the collar of his utility uniform, and executed a flawless hip toss. Tanner's massive body went airborne. He hit the unyielding linoleum floor with a thunderous crash that rattled the nearby tables. The wind was instantly driven from his lungs in a violently wet gasp. Before Tanner could even process what had just happened, Sarah dropped her knee with surgical precision directly onto his solar plexus, pinning him to the floor. Simultaneously, she secured his injured right arm, wrapping it in a brutal chimera lock, pulling the limb up behind his shoulder blade. 1 millimeter of extra pressure, and she would sever the rotator cuff completely. The entire exchange had taken less than 3 seconds. The mess hall erupted into absolute chaos, Trays crashed to the floor. Marines vaulted over tables, yelling in shock, "Get off him!" Matthews yelled, taking a step forward, his fists balled. Sarah snapped her gaze to Matthews. Her eyes were dark, hollow, and utterly terrifying. "Take one more step, Lance Corporal, and I will rip his arm off and beat you to death with it." Matthews froze, paralyzed by the sheer, unadulterated menace radiating from the woman kneeling on his squad leader. Even Private Dawson took a panicked step backward. The woman didn't look like a supply clerk anymore. She looked like a demon masquerading in a human skin suit. "Arrest her." Tanner wheezed from the floor, spitting blood and saliva, his face contorted in agony. "She assaulted me. Get the MPs. I want her in irons." Right on cue, 4 military police officers pushed through the crowd, their hands resting cautiously on their holstered sidearms. The senior MP, a burly sergeant, assessed the scene with wide eyes. A 200-pound Marine was being effortlessly subdued by an unmarked female who didn't even look like she had broken a sweat. "Ma'am, release the corporal and step back with your hands in the air." The MP sergeant commanded, his voice tight with adrenaline. Sarah didn't move an inch. She kept the pressure on Tanner's arm, her eyes locked onto the MP's. "This Marine assaulted me," she stated calmly. "I neutralized the threat. I don't care what happened. You need to let him go right now." The MP shouted, drawing his baton, "Last warning." Before the MPs could advance, a sharp, authoritative voice sliced through the tension like a scalpel. "Stand down, Sergeant, right now." The crowd parted as a man pushed his way to the front. It was Captain Gregory Hayes, the base commander. He was flanked by a man who looked like he had just crawled out of a war zone. The man was dressed in civilian tactical gear-faded denim, a combat shirt, and a heavily worn plate carrier. He had a thick, unruly beard and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. But it was what was pinned to the center of the man's chest that made the air completely vanish from the room. A solid gold trident, the eagle, the anchor, the trident, and the flintlock pistol. The unmistakable insignia of a United States Navy SEAL. Master Chief Robert Hoss Miller took one look at the scene, took in the spilled coffee, Tanner's screaming face, and Sarah's flawless joint lock, and let out a heavy, tired sigh. "Whisper," Hoss said calmly, crossing his arms over his armored chest. "Let him up. You're getting blood on the floor." Sarah held the lock for a fraction of a second longer, letting Tanner feel the precipice of a broken arm before seamlessly releasing him. She stood up, brushing the invisible dust from her sterile uniform, her expression returning to total apathy. Tanner rolled over, cradling his throbbing arm, tears of pain and humiliation streaming down his face. "Captain Hayes," Tanner choked out, looking up at the base commander. "She assaulted me. Throw her in the brig." Captain Hayes looked at Tanner with a mixture of profound pity and absolute disgust. He then turned his gaze to the MP sergeant, who was still holding his baton. "Sergeant," Captain Hayes said, his voice deadly quiet, "arrest Corporal Tanner for assaulting a superior officer." Oak. The mess hall went dead silent. You could hear the faint hum of the broken air conditioning unit. Tanner stopped groaning, his eyes widened in sheer disbelief. "Superior officer. She's not an officer, she's a nobody. She doesn't even have a rank." Master Chief Hoss stepped forward, kneeling slightly so he was eye-level with the pathetic, crumpled Marine on the floor. He pulled a small, laminated badge from a hidden pocket on his rig and held it inches from Tanner's face. "Corporal," Hoss rumbled, his voice low and dangerous, "the woman who just embarrassed you in front of 300 of your peers is Lieutenant Commander Sarah Jenkins. She's the team leader of an experimental integration element with a Naval Special Warfare Development Group. She has a higher security clearance than the base commander, and she has more confirmed kills than your entire battalion." Hoss leaned in closer, the scent of gunpowder and chewing tobacco washing over Tanner. "You didn't just assault a woman, son. You struck a Tier 1 operator. And frankly, you should be thanking God she only broke your arm." The silence in the mess hall was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. The only sound was the strange, shallow breathing of Corporal Derek Tanner as the reality of his situation violently aligned with the gravity of his mistake. "Get him out of my sight," Captain Hayes ordered, his voice clicked and devoid of any sympathy. The military police, suddenly moving with a renewed sense of urgency and deep respect, practically dragged the massive Marine to his feet. Tanner didn't struggle. The fight had been entirely drained out of him, replaced by a sickening cocktail of physical agony and impending doom. As they hauled him toward the exit, his lackeys, Private Dawson and Lance Corporal Matthews, pressed themselves against the wall, trying desperately to become invisible. "Dawson, Matthews," Captain Hayes barked, not even turning to look at them. "You will report to the Naval Criminal Investigative Service Field Office in exactly 10 minutes to provide sworn statements. If you omit a single detail of what your squad leader just did, I will personally see to it that you share his cell at Leavenworth." "Understood?" "Yes, sir," they chorused, their voices cracking with sheer terror. They bolted for the exit, leaving Tanner's abandoned lunch tray as the only evidence they had ever been there. Meanwhile, Master Chief Hoss clamped a heavy, calloused hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Come on, LTT, let's get you that coffee. The captain has a pot brewing in the SIF." 10 minutes later, inside the sensitive compartmented information facility, a soundproof, heavily secured room within the base headquarters, Sarah finally got her coffee. It was served in a chipped ceramic mug, but it was hot, and that was all that mattered. She sat slouched in a leather chair, the adrenaline finally leaving her system, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. Captain Hayes sat behind his desk, rubbing his temples, while Hoss leaned against the reinforced steel door. "I apologize for that, Commander Jenkins," Hayes said, genuinely contrite. "Tanner has been a disciplinary problem for months, but his chain of command kept sweeping his infractions under the rug. He's a bully, plain and simple." Sarah took a slow sip of her coffee. "It's fine, Captain. Men like Tanner usually sort themselves out eventually. They just need to hit a wall they can't punch through." "Well, he certainly found his wall today," Hoss chuckled, crossing his arms. "Flawless Kimura, by the way, though I think you went a little easy on him." "I was tired," Sarah deadpanned. Hayes sighed, opening a secure folder on his desk. "The problem, Commander, is the bureaucracy. Tanner isn't just a loudmouth corporal. He's the nephew of Colonel Richard Stanton. Stanton is a heavyweight over at CENTCOM, and he's known for being ruthlessly protective of his family's military legacy. The moment I file these Article 128 assault charges, Stanton is going to unleash hell on this base. He's going to try to spin this, claim excessive force, and paint you as the aggressor." Sarah's eyes remained completely impassive. "Let him try." "With all due respect, ma'am," Hayes continued, his brow furrowed in concern, "Colonel Stanton has the ear of the Joint Chiefs. If he pushes for a court-martial against you for striking an enlisted man, it could get incredibly messy. Your file is so heavily classified that we can't even legally prove you are on this base without violating national security protocols." Hoss let out a low, rumbling laugh. It was a sound that usually preceded extreme violence or extreme amusement. In this case, it was the latter. "Captain," Hoss said, pushing himself off the door, "with all due respect to Colonel Stanton, he is playing checkers, and the commander here is playing thermonuclear chess. Let him make his phone calls." Across the base, in the sterile holding cell of the MP station, Tanner was cradling his right arm in a temporary sling. The base corpsman had popped his hyperextended elbow back into place, a procedure that had left Tanner sweating and vomiting into a metal bucket. Now he sat on the cold steel bench, glaring at the single telephone on the wall. He was allowed one call. He dialed the secure number with trembling, left-handed fingers. The line clicked, and a gruff, authoritative voice answered. "Stanton." "Uncle Rick," Tanner choked out, his tough guy facade completely shattering into pathetic desperation. "It's Derek. I need help. They're trying to ruin me." Colonel Richard Stanton, sitting in a plush, air-conditioned office in Tampa, Florida, gripped his phone tighter. "Derek, what the hell happened? Are you in the brig?" "It was a setup." Tanner lied, the words tumbling out in a panicked rush. "There was this contractor. She was sitting in our section. I asked her to move, and she completely lost it. She attacked me, Uncle Rick." She snapped my arm. "And then they claimed she was some secret Navy SEAL officer. Captain Hayes is pressing charges against me. You have to fix this." Stanton's face hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. A female SEAL? That's the most ridiculous cover story I've ever heard. Hayes is an idiot if he thinks he can railroad my nephew to protect some unhinged private contractor. Don't say another word to the MPs, Delic. I'm shutting this down right now. Stanton slammed the phone down. He didn't know who this woman was, and he didn't care. No one humiliated the Stanton family. He immediately ordered his adjutant to set up a priority, encrypted video teleconference VTC with the base commander at Camp Lemonnier. He was about to end a career. He just didn't realize it was going to be his own. 2 hours later, Captain Hayes, Master Chief Hoss, and Lieutenant Commander Sarah Jenkins were summoned back to the Seaside. The massive flat-screen monitor mounted on the wall hummed to life, displaying the furious, red-faced visage of Colonel Richard Stanton. Stanton didn't bother with military pleasantries. He came out swinging. "Captain Hayes, I want my nephew released from custody immediately," Stanton demanded, his voice booming through the speakers. "I have already drafted the paperwork to transfer him back to the States. Furthermore, I want the name and contracting agency of the woman who assaulted him. I am having her barred from every military installation in the world, and I will be pushing for federal assault charges." Hayes sat perfectly straight, his hands folded on his desk. "Colonel Stanton, with all due respect, your nephew initiated the physical altercation. We have over 50 sworn statements from witnesses, including 2 of his own squad mates, confirming that Corporal Tanner struck first. I don't care about the statements of intimidated lower enlisted personnel." Stanton roared. "My nephew told me what happened. This woman provoked him, used excessive lethal force martial arts on a United States Marine, and then you had the audacity to claim she was a Tier 1 operator to cover your own incompetence." Stanton paused, his eyes narrowing as he noticed Sarah sitting quietly in the background, her face partially obscured by the shadows of the room. She was sipping a fresh cup of coffee, looking profoundly bored. "Is that her?" Stanton sneered, pointing a finger at the camera. "Is that the so-called Navy SEAL who broke my nephew's arm? You look like a supply clerk. Stand up when a superior officer is speaking to you, contractor." Sarah didn't move. She just stared into the camera, her dead-eyed gaze cutting through the digital feed. Before Stanton could continue his tirade, a secondary chime echoed through the SCI. Another feed was patching into the highly secured line. The encryption protocols flashed rapidly on the screen, indicating a clearance level that made Captain Hayes instantly sit up straighter. The screen split. On the right side was the furious Colonel Stanton. On the left side was a man sitting in an immaculate Pentagon office. He wore the stark white uniform of the United States Navy, and the lapels of his collar bore 3 silver stars. Vice Admiral Thomas Gallagher, commander of the Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC. "Admiral," Captain Hayes said, immediately snapping a salute, followed quickly by Hoss. Sarah remained seated, but gave a subtle, respectful nod. Stanton's face went completely pale. "Admiral Gallagher, I wasn't aware JSOC was monitoring this frequency." "I monitor everything that involves my Black Squadron personnel, Colonel Stanton," Admiral Gallagher said, his voice as smooth and cold as glacial ice. "I was reviewing the after-action reports from the Horn of Africa, and I noticed a flag on Lieutenant Commander Jenkins' file regarding a disciplinary incident. I decided to tune in to see how you were handling it." Stanton swallowed hard, his arrogance rapidly evaporating. "Admiral, sir, this woman, Lieutenant Commander Jenkins, assaulted my nephew. She broke his arm over a seating dispute in the mess hall." Gallagher leaned forward, his piercing blue eyes locking onto Stanton through the screen. "Colonel, let me make something abundantly clear to you. Lieutenant Commander Jenkins is not just a SEAL. She is the tip of the spear for the most classified kinetic operations this nation conducts. Do you know where she was for the 72 hours prior to your nephew's little temper tantrum?" Stanton shook his head mutely. "She was 60 miles deep in hostile territory," Gallagher continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "She and her 4-man element infiltrated a fortified compound belonging to Al-Shabaab. They executed a high-risk night raid to neutralize a cell that was preparing a coordinated mortar attack." Gallagher paused, letting the silence stretch out agonizingly. "Do you know the target of that mortar attack, Colonel Stanton?" Stanton looked like he was going to be sick. "No, sir." "Forward operating base Kismail," Gallagher stated bluntly, "where your son, First Lieutenant David Stanton, is currently deployed." They had the coordinates locked in. They were hours away from leveling the barracks. Commander Jenkins personally neutralized the cell leader and secured the launch codes, ensuring your son didn't come home in a flag-draped casket. The color completely drained from Stanton's face. He stared at Sarah, who was still sitting quietly, offering no boast, no smirk, no acknowledgement of her heroism. She had saved his son's life, and in return, his nephew had tried to knock her teeth out. "She hasn't slept in 3 days," Gallagher pressed on, the full weight of his authority crushing Stanton. "She returned to base, requested a cup of coffee, and was subsequently attacked by a pathetic, undisciplined bully who thinks his rank gives him the right to put his hands on women. And instead of letting her rest, you drag her into this bureaucratic circus." "Admiral, I didn't know," Stanton stammered, completely broken. "Ignorance is not an excuse for defending a toxic culture, Colonel," Gallagher snapped. "Here is what is going to happen. You are going to withdraw your transfer request. Corporal Tanner is going to face a general court-martial for assaulting a superior commissioned officer. He will be stripped of his rank. He will serve his time in Leavenworth, and he will receive a dishonorable discharge. If you attempt to interfere, or if you ever speak to Commander Jenkins again, I will personally see to it that your career ends before the sun goes down. Do we have an understanding?" "Yes, Admiral," Stanton whispered, utterly defeated. "Understood." "Good." Disconnect. Stanton's feed went black. Admiral Gallagher's expression softened slightly as he looked at Sarah. "Good work on the Kismayo raid, Whisper. Take 48 hours of mandatory downtime. Then I need you back in the air. We have a situation developing in Yemen." "Understood, Admiral," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "Thank you, sir." The screen went black. The SCIF was quiet again. Captain Hayes let out a long breath, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "Well, I suppose that resolves the paperwork issue." Haas slapped the wall, laughing quietly. "Like I said, thermonuclear chess." Sarah finally stood up, tossing her empty coffee cup into the trash can by the door. She adjusted her sterile, unmarked uniform, the phantom weight of her trident resting silently against her chest. "If we're done here, Captain," Sarah said, walking toward the heavy steel door, "I'm going to go find an empty rack. I need some sleep." She walked out into the blinding African sun, completely invisible to the thousands of personnel bustling around the base. She wasn't a hero they would ever read about. She wasn't a legend they would ever sing songs of. She was simply a predator returning to the shadows, waiting for the next call. That is the reality of the shadows. The most dangerous warriors don't wear their lethal skills on their sleeves, and real karma always collects its debts. If you loved this story of brutal justice and hidden heroes, smash that like button and share this video. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell for more real-life military drama. Let us know in the comments, what would you have done?